In a small town, cradled by lush fields and gentle hills that painted the horizon like a living masterpiece, lived Mrs. Maria. At 80 years old, her face bore the marks of time as though she were collecting stories. Each wrinkle, a chapter of her life. Each glance, a lesson learned in the silent moments of existence. The town, with its dirt roads and modest homes, was a place where time seemed to move more slowly. Here, amidst the birdsong and the scent of wildflowers, Mrs. Maria built her life, planted her dreams, and reaped her sorrows. Loneliness, the inevitable companion of her days, became as familiar as the wooden rosary her wrinkled hands caressed every night. From a young age, Maria learned that life does not offer only paths lined with roses. She lost her husband, Joseph, after 40 years of companionship, when a harsh winter claimed his fragile health. Years later, she watched her only son depart, a victim of a tragic accident on the highways winding through distant mountains. And so, amidst restrained tears and whispered prayers, she learned to transform pain into faith, absence into a divine presence. Her modest, welcoming home was a sanctuary of memories. On the main wall, faded portraits formed a mosaic of beloved faces, frozen smiles that visited her during her loneliest hours. On the bedside table, next to the bed covered with a patchwork quilt crafted by her own hands, lay a well-worn Bible, its pages marked and underlined, bearing witness to her intimate conversations with God. That autumn afternoon, as the sun painted the leaves with a golden hue while they danced on the gentle breeze, Mrs. Maria felt something different. Seated in her rocking chair on the porch, watching the horizon ignite with the colors of dusk, an inexplicable certainty took hold of her heart. It was a calling, a silent summons echoing in her soul with the force of 1,000 storms and the tenderness of a spring breeze. "I must go to St. Lucy's Chapel," she thought to herself, feeling her heart race in a way it hadn't in years. That small chapel, perched atop a distant hill 62 miles away, was the place where, in her youth, she had made her most sincere promises. It was there that she had wed, that she had baptized her son, and bid farewell to loved ones. And now, something was beckoning her back, with both urgency and serenity. The decision was made before she could even rationalize the challenges that such a journey would impose on her aging body. Her knees ached on damp mornings, her spine curved slightly like a willow in the wind, and her steps no longer possessed the firmness of before. But something stronger than physical limitations propelled her. The need to express gratitude, to offer God a tangible sign of recognition for every second of life granted, for every pain transformed into wisdom, for every tear dried by the unseen hand of faith. That night, Mrs. Maria slept with a tranquility she had not known in years. Her dreams were filled with images of the path that awaited her, not as a menacing challenge, but as a promise of redemption. She awoke even before the first rays of sunlight penetrated the lightly draped window. Her movements were precise and resolute. She prepared a small travel bag with only the essentials: a change of clothes, a piece of bread, a bottle of water, and her inseparable rosary. Before leaving her home, she paused for a moment before the small home altar, where an image of Our Lady of Grace rested among candles and dried flowers. "Accompany me, Mother," she whispered, making the sign of the cross with devotion. She did not inform anyone of her departure. Her dialogue was with God, and only He needed to know her plans. Her first steps were taken as dawn began to tint the sky in shades of pink and orange, like a divine watercolor heralding a new beginning. The road that meandered out of town was deserted at that hour, save for the birds celebrating the day's awakening. Mrs. Maria adjusted her shawl over her shoulders, and with a deep sigh that seemed to gather all the strength of her being, began her pilgrimage. Each step was a prayer, each breath a note of gratitude. The first miles were covered with the determination of one who walks not merely on the earth, but through time itself. In her mind, memories emerged as fellow travelers: Joseph's smile as she passed him on a morning walk, the aroma of the coffee he prepared on Sundays, her son's small hands holding hers as he learned to walk. "Lord, thank you for these Moments etched in my soul, she murmured as her feet touched the rocky ground. Thank you even for the pain that taught me to cherish each instant of happiness. The sun was already high when Mrs. Maria glimpsed the first crossroads. There, in the shade of a large, leafy tree, she rested for a few minutes, sipping sparingly from the water she had brought. It was then that she noticed the approach of a middle-aged man riding a carriage pulled by a chestnut horse. The man, upon seeing her seated alone by the roadside, slowed his mount's pace. "Good morning, ma'am," he greeted in a deep, gentle voice. "Might you need some help? It's unusual to find someone resting here, especially a lady on her own." Mrs. Maria looked up at the stranger and smiled with the serenity of one who carries inner peace. "I am on my way to St. Lucy's Chapel," she replied simply. "It's a long journey, but every step is a blessing." The man frowned, visibly surprised by her answer. "The chapel is many miles from here, ma'am. Wouldn't it be wiser to wait for transport or company? My feet are my transport, and God is my companion," Mrs. Maria answered, rising carefully. "This walk is my way of giving thanks for all I have experienced." The man, who introduced himself as Joseph, Joachim in his native tongue, a local farmer, was moved by the determination of this elderly lady, fragile in appearance yet steadfast in spirit. He offered her a ride to the next town, but Mrs. Maria politely declined. "Every step must be taken by me," she explained. "It is my sacrifice, my offering." Joseph understood the profound meaning of her words. Before continuing on his way, he offered her fresh water from his canteen and shared a piece of cheese made on his farm. As they ate in the shade of the yacht tree, they exchanged life stories. He spoke of the drought ravaging his crops and his faith that the rain would come on time. She recounted the harsh winters she had endured, and how hope always blossomed after every storm. "You show me that the problems I face are trivial compared to the grandeur of life," Joseph confessed before bidding her farewell. "Your faith renews mine." Mrs. Maria continued on, carrying not only her own memories but also the certainty that this encounter was no accident. Every person on our path, she believed, is a divine messenger, bringing lessons or collecting insights. The miles accumulated beneath her tired feet. The midday heat caused small beads of sweat to trickle down her wrinkled face. The landscape gradually changed. Open fields gave way to small groves, and the terrain grew more rugged, demanding greater effort with every step. Yet Mrs. Maria refused to let discouragement overtake her. When fatigue threatened, she closed her eyes for a moment and recalled the times in her life when she had thought she could not go on. The loss of Joseph, the departure of her son, the nights of solitude and abandonment. And then, like a silent miracle, her strength was renewed, as if an invisible energy flowed through her, sustaining her when her muscles could no longer bear the strain. At the end of the first day, as the sky once again blazed with the hues of twilight, Mrs. Maria spotted a small village on the horizon. Her legs trembled with exhaustion. Her feet were sore from worn shoes, yet her spirit remained resolute. Upon arriving at the first houses of the settlement, she was met with curious glances. It was unusual to see an elderly woman walking alone in these parts, particularly with a face marked by physical weariness, but illuminated by an almost otherworldly determination. A young woman, noticing her slight staggering, approached with evident concern in her blue eyes. "Ma'am, are you all right? Do you need any help?" she asked, genuinely worried. Mrs. Maria smiled, grateful for the kindness. "I'm just tired from the walk, dear. I'm looking for a place to spend the night before continuing my journey tomorrow." "My name is Helen," the young woman introduced herself. "You can stay at my home if you like. It isn't much, but there's a clean bed and warm food." That night, in Helen's small house, Mrs. Maria once again experienced the warmth of human connection. Helen had been living on her own since losing her parents in an epidemic that had struck the region years earlier. She worked as a teacher at the town's only school, devoting her life to educating children who, like her, understood the meaning of loss and perseverance. Over a steaming bowl of soup, Mrs. Maria recounted her journey to Helen, the 62 miles that separated her from St. Lucy's Chapel, the inexplicable calling she had felt, the need to thank God for a life filled with both challenges and blessings. "How do you find the strength for such a journey?" Helen asked in awe. "I'm young, and I don't know if I'd have the courage to do so." "The strength does not come from me, dear," Mrs. Maria replied tenderly. "It comes from the one who sustains us when we think we can go no further. Every step I take is like a bead on a rosary, a silent prayer, a thank you for being alive, for feeling the wind on my face, for witnessing the colors of the world." Helen observed the elderly woman with growing fascination. There was something within her that transcended physical frailty, a radiant quality that seemed to glow from within. "You remind me of my grandmother," Helen confessed, her eyes glistening. She, too, had an unwavering faith, a certainty that everything had a purpose, even the deepest pain. "And she was right, dear," affirmed Mrs. Maria, taking Helen's hands in hers. "It is in the storms that we discover what we're made of. It is in the darkness that we learn to appreciate the light." That night, lying in the simple bed Helen had provided, Mrs. Maria felt that her journey was already bearing fruit even before reaching its destination. Those encounters, those exchanges of experiences and emotions were part of the miracle she sought to witness. She fell asleep with the certainty that even if her fragile body did not complete the path, her soul had already traversed unimaginable distances. The second day dawned overcast, with dense clouds promising rain. Helen urged Mrs. Maria to wait for better weather, but the elderly lady was determined to continue on her path. "Rain is also a blessing," she said with a serene smile. "It washes the earth and renews life, just as tears cleanse the soul and refresh the spirit." Touched by the wisdom and determination of this extraordinary woman, Helen decided to accompany her for a few hours. "I only have classes this afternoon," she explained. "I can walk with you in the morning if you'll allow it." And so, under a low gray sky that seemed within reach, the two women, separated by decades yet united by a shared inner quest, set off together. For the next leg of the journey, Helen carried a small bag with fruits and bread, insisting that Mrs. Maria eat well. As they walked, the young teacher shared her doubts, her fears, her sense that life sometimes seemed devoid of meaning. Mrs. Maria listened intently, responding, not with ready-made advice but with stories from her own life, with examples of how she found light in her darkest moments. "When I lost my son," Mrs. Maria recounted, her voice trembling, "I thought I could not bear the pain. It was as if every breath was an immense effort, as if every heartbeat was a betrayal to the one who had left. I spent days unable to rise or find the will to continue. Then, in one particularly difficult early morning, I felt a presence in my room, not something I could see or touch, but something that filled the space like a subtle fragrance. And I heard, not with my ears but with my soul, a voice saying, 'He is well, and you still have much to do here.' In that moment, I understood that pain would not vanish, but I could coexist with it without letting it destroy me." Helen listened with silent tears streaming down her youthful face. "How did you know it wasn't just your imagination trying to comfort your heart?" "There are things we know beyond reason, my dear," Mrs. Maria replied softly. "They are certainties that reside in a place deeper than our thoughts. It's like recognizing the voice of a loved one in a crowd. You need not see them to know they are there." Rain began to fall as they had covered a few miles. At first, scattered droplets dotted the dusty ground, but soon it turned into a downpour that soaked their clothes and blurred their vision. Helen suggested they seek shelter, worried about the elderly lady's health. Yet Mrs. Maria seemed almost delighted by this additional trial. "Rain cleanses the path and purifies our intent," she said, lifting her face to feel the droplets on her weathered skin. "Each drop is a blessing falling from the heavens directly upon us." They found temporary refuge under a large tree, its sprawling branches offering some protection from the relentless rain. Huddled close together, they shared the bread and fruit Helen had brought. The young teacher noticed that despite the obvious fatigue, Mrs. Maria appeared more alive, more radiant with every step taken on that journey. "You look younger today than you did yesterday," Helen remarked sincerely. Mrs. Maria smiled, revealing the few remaining teeth she still had. "It is because every step toward gratitude draws us closer to our true essence. The more we give thanks, the younger our soul becomes." When the rain subsided, it was time for Helen to return to town for her duties as a teacher. Their farewell was emotional. In less than 24 hours, those two souls had forged a connection that transcended time and circumstance. "Promise you'll visit me when you return from your pilgrimage," Helen pleaded, embracing the elderly woman warmly. "If God permits me to complete this journey, I will tell you every detail," Mrs. Maria promised. "And if not, know that I will carry your light with me until the end." Helen departed with a transformed heart, carrying lessons no book could ever teach. And Mrs. Maria continued alone, now facing a steeper, more challenging terrain. The rain had turned the path into slippery mud, demanding even more attention and balance with each hesitant step. The second day of walking was marked by even tougher physical trials. The strong wind seemed to push her backward, as if testing her resolve. Her aching knees and persistent pain in her curved back constantly reminded her of her human frailty. Yet moments of indescribable beauty punctuated the struggle. A rainbow emerging after the storm, stretching like a colorful bridge over the valley. Unfamiliar birds singing in a natural symphony. Wildflowers blooming by the roadside as small miracles of color and fragrance. "For all this, Lord, I thank you," Mrs. Maria murmured as she walked. "For every pain that reminds me I am alive. For every beauty that reaffirms your presence." By the evening of the second day, her steps became slower, heavier. Every meter required a superhuman effort. Then she spotted, in the distance, a small building that seemed to be an abandoned barn. With the last of her strength, she made her way there, seeking shelter for the approaching night. The barn was empty and dusty, yet it offered protection against the increasingly fierce wind. Mrs. Maria settled on a mound of dry straw, silently, grateful for this unexpected refuge. She ate the last piece of bread Helen had given her, and drank the final sips from her water bottle. Her lips were chapped, her legs trembled with exhaustion, but in her heart burned an undying flame of determination. That night, alone in the silent barn, Mrs. Maria was visited by vivid dreams. She saw herself young once more, running through fields with her small son in her arms. She saw Joseph smiling at her with that look that always made her feel like the most beautiful woman in the world. She saw people she had known throughout her life, some no longer present, others still here on earth. They all seemed to encourage her to continue. All seemed to remind her that her journey held a purpose far greater than she could fathom. She awoke before dawn, her body aching, yet her spirit renewed. She knew this day would be the most challenging. About 25 miles remained until the chapel, and her strength visibly waned. Yet there was something different that morning. An inexplicable certainty that she was not alone, that every step was accompanied by unseen presences lending their strength and guidance. The third day dawned clear and cool, as if nature itself wished to compensate for the previous day's hardships. Mrs. Maria adjusted her shawl over her bowed shoulders and set off toward the rising sun. Her journey now took her through more mountainous terrain, where the path wound between rugged cliffs and deep valleys. The wild beauty of that landscape filled her heart with reverence and thankfulness. It was later that morning, when the sun was high, that Mrs. Maria encountered a group of pilgrims also headed for St. Lucy's Chapel. There were 5 of them, 3 women and 2 men, walking together with small backpacks and softly singing hymnals. Upon seeing the elderly lady walking alone, her steps unsteady yet determined, they approached in awe and admiration. "Are you on your way to the chapel?" asked one of the women, a middle-aged lady named Constance. "Yes, my dear," Mrs. Maria replied with a weary smile. "It is a promise I made to God, a promise to give thanks for all I have lived." "But you are alone. From where do you come?" inquired another pilgrim, a sturdy man named Anthony. "I come from the town of St. Benedict," Mrs. Maria answered. "I have been walking for 2 days." The pilgrims exchanged looks of astonishment. St. Benedict lay nearly 43 miles away, and this fragile elderly woman had journeyed that distance on foot, driven solely by her unshakable faith. "Come with us, Mrs. Maria," Constance invited with tears in her eyes. "We will share our water and food. Together we shall reach the chapel." And so, on the 3rd day of her journey, Mrs. Maria was no longer alone. She now walked in the company of these pilgrims who, touched by her example of faith and determination, adjusted their pace to match hers, offered support when the path grew steeper, and shared stories and songs that eased the journey. "You are a living miracle," Anthony remarked as he helped her across a particularly treacherous segment. "Your faith both humbles and inspires me." Mrs. Maria smiled humbly. "There is nothing extraordinary about me, my child. I am simply an old woman grateful for each day God has granted me." Yet the pilgrims knew they were witnessing something extraordinary, not a spectacular miracle as described in scriptures, but a quiet, enduring miracle wrought by painful steps and unwavering faith. As they neared the chapel, the terrain became more rugged. The hill on which the chapel had been built centuries ago towered as a final challenge to these weary pilgrims. Mrs. Maria felt her strength quickly ebbing. Every step now was an act of pure will, sustained no longer by weakened muscles but by something deeper and everlasting. "We're almost there, Mrs. Maria," Constance encouraged, gripping the elderly woman's arm firmly. "You can see the chapel at the top of the hill." And it was true. There it stood, a simple stone and wood structure with a small bell tower set against the clear afternoon sky. The sight of that sacred place filled Mrs. Maria's heart with an indescribable emotion. It was as if her entire life had converged to this moment, as if every step she had taken over her 80 years had led her exactly to this place, at this precise moment. The final stretch of the climb was the most arduous. Some parts of the path were nearly vertical, requiring even the younger pilgrims to help carry Mrs. Maria at times, but she insisted on placing her own feet on the ground whenever possible. Every step was an offering, every effort a token of thanks. When they finally reached the stone steps leading to the chapel entrance, the sun was setting, bathing everything in a golden light that seemed to transform the world into a celestial vision. Mrs. Maria paused for a moment, catching her breath, feeling her heart pounding not only from physical exertion, but from overwhelming emotion. "I have arrived, Lord," she whispered, tears freely streaming down her wrinkled face. "I have come to give thanks." Respecting that sacred moment, the pilgrim stepped back, allowing Mrs. Maria to ascend the final steps alone. Every step was a victory, every movement a celebration. Upon reaching the chapel door, she felt as if an immense burden had been lifted. Not the weight of physical fatigue, but the weight of all the sorrows, all the losses, all the tears shed throughout her life. Inside, the chapel was nearly empty. Only a few lit candles illuminated the simple altar, where an image of Saint Lucy watched over visitors with merciful eyes. Mrs. Maria walked slowly down the central aisle, her footsteps echoing in the reverent silence. Upon reaching the altar, she knelt with difficulty, leaning on the worn wooden pew. Then in that moment of complete surrender, words flowed from her heart like a torrent. "Thank you, Lord, for every second of life you have granted me. Thank you for the joys and the sorrows, for the meetings and the farewells, for sunny days and stormy nights. Thank you for Joseph and our son, for every moment we shared on this earth, for every smile, every embrace, every look of love. Thank you for the strength you gave me to continue when I thought I could not. Thank you for the faith you planted in my heart, a tiny seed that blossomed in the driest times. Thank you for the strangers who became friends along the way, for the angels in disguise sent to rescue me when I faltered. Thank you for the beauty of the world you created, for the flowers, the birds, the majestic mountains, and the gentle valleys. Thank you for the gift of life, for the miracle of every sunrise, for the privilege of feeling, loving, suffering, and waiting. Thank you, my God, for every step of this journey, not only for these 62 miles I have walked to your house, but for the entire pilgrimage of my earthly existence. Everything was grace, everything a gift, everything love. Her tears flowed unchecked now, cleansing her soul of all bitterness, all resentment, all misunderstanding. They were tears of pure, crystalline gratitude, springing from a heart finally, at peace with itself and the world. When the pilgrims entered the chapel, they found Mrs. Maria still kneeling, her face aglow with a serenity that seemed not of this world. One by one they knelt beside her, forming a circle of prayer and thankfulness. That night, Mrs. Maria slept in a small guest house adjoining the chapel, a humble shelter for pilgrims like herself. Her body was utterly exhausted. Every muscle ached, every joint protested the superhuman effort, but her soul had never felt so light, so complete, so utterly at peace. The next day, as the first rays of sunshine filtered through the simple window of her room, Constance and the other pilgrims found Mrs. Maria seated on her bed, her hands folded on her lap and a serene smile upon her face. Her eyes, now closed to this world, seemed to behold a reality far more beautiful and perfect than our own. She had completed her journey, not only the 62-mile pilgrimage to the chapel, but the grand pilgrimage of life. Her final act was one of pure gratitude, her last offering her tired body which, having fulfilled its mission, could finally rest. News of the 80-year-old woman who walked 62 miles to thank God spread quickly throughout the surrounding towns. People who had never met her came to pay their respects, touched by the quiet strength of her testimony. Helen, the young teacher who had taken her in, wept as if losing a part of herself, yet she knew that something of Mrs. Maria would remain in her heart forever. The funeral was held in none other than St. Lucy's Chapel itself. The small sanctuary, normally quiet during the week, was filled with people from all the places Mrs. Maria had passed through on her pilgrimage. Each person carried a different story about how this frail, determined elderly woman had touched their lives, transformed their perspectives, and renewed their own faith. Joseph, the farmer who had met her on the first day of her walk, recounted how he returned home that day with newfound hope in his heart, how he faced the drought with renewed confidence, and how, days later, rain finally fell on his parched fields. "She taught me that faith can move mountains," he said with a choked voice. Constance recalled how, during the final stretch of the journey, even in her exhaustion and wavering steps, Mrs. Maria found the strength to console her by sharing her own sorrows and disappointments. "She told me that our wounds are windows for divine light to enter, if only we allow it. I will never forget those words." Anthony, the sturdy pilgrim who had helped carry Mrs. Maria on some of the steeper parts, explained how his understanding of strength and weakness had been utterly transformed. "I discovered that true strength lies not in our muscles, but in our spirit. That little lady was stronger than all of us combined." But it was Helen who, with simple and heartfelt words, captured what everyone felt. Mrs. Maria wasn't undertaking just any pilgrimage. She was teaching us how to live, with gratitude, with faith, with the certainty that every step, however painful, has a purpose. She turned her suffering into love, her loneliness into communion, her pain into an offering. What could be more sacred than that? After the ceremony, once everyone had departed, the local pastor found on the altar a small wooden rosary, the same one Mrs. Maria's wrinkled hands had caressed for so many lonely nights. Beside it lay a folded note containing a simple request that the item be given to Helen, the young teacher, as a symbol of the continuity of faith and gratitude. And so the story of the 80-year-old woman who walked 62 miles to thank God continued, to touch hearts, inspire souls, and transform lives, not as a distant legend from mythical times, but as a living testament that true faith, when genuine, knows no age or circumstance, is not daunted by mountains or deep valleys, and does not shrink before storms or deserts. Because true faith, as Mrs. Maria demonstrated with every painful step of her journey, is made not just of words or rituals, but of concrete steps toward love, gratitude, and complete surrender. It is a pilgrimage that lasts a lifetime, and even in the darkest and loneliest moments, lights the way not only for those who live it, but for all who have the grace to cross its path, even if only for a fleeting moment. And perhaps this is the greatest miracle of all, that a frail old woman struggling along dusty roads can remind us that real strength lies in our ability to give thanks, to recognize in every breath, every heartbeat, every tear shed the endless miracle of the life granted to us.